Hi, welcome to Military Justice Stories YouTube channel. Here we uncover shocking military courtroom cases, hidden betrayals, and powerful stories that change lives forever. So stay tuned, because some stories should never have been buried.
Yeah.
And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more powerful military justice stories every week.
4 months ago, my mother died. She left her entire house and $240,000 in savings to my daughter Sophie. My older sister Deborah didn't receive a single cent, so she decided to take it herself. She called it a family meeting. But when Sophie walked through that front door on a gray Saturday afternoon, there was no coffee on the stove, no food on the table, no family gathering in any sense the word was meant to carry. There was a bottom feeder lawyer with a property waiver form, a rehearsed script, and 3 adults who had positioned themselves around a 21-year-old kid the way you position people, when you want someone to feel they have no way out. They had one significant miscalculation. They thought I wouldn't find out until it was already over. They forgot what I do for a living. My name is Major Alicia Hunt, United States Army. And the moment they put their hands on my daughter, they didn't just cross a line. They declared war on the wrong person. Let me take you back to January. To the dead, cold center of it. Gray Tuesday, Millbrook Cemetery. The kind of morning that feels like the sky has been wrung out, everything pale, everything flat, the light offering nothing that resembles warmth. 42 people stood in a loose circle around the fresh cut in the frozen earth. The air smelled of wet soil, dead pine needles, and the exhaust from the idling hearse. I stood in full uniform. Spine straight, chin level, the Ohio wind cutting straight across my face like it had a point to make. 20 years of service teaches you how to lock your body down regardless of what your insides are doing. You learn to scan a perimeter even when what you're scanning is a graveyard where your mother is being buried. Beside me, Sophie was falling apart. Her fingers gripped a shredded fistful of tissue. Her small shoulders shivered with every choked breath she was trying to hide. She had just lost the person who had anchored her through the hardest 2 years of her life. Then there was Deborah. My older sister arrived exactly 20 minutes late. Her massive black SUV rolled up the gravel path loud and disruptive, the engine announcing her the way she had always preferred to be announced. She stepped out onto the mud in designer sunglasses that covered half her face. No rush, no visible grief. No movement toward Sophie to offer comfort, no hand on my shoulder, no acknowledgement of what this day cost the rest of us. She positioned herself at the outer edge of the gathering, crossed her arms over her expensive coat, and let her eyes drift slowly across the funeral wreaths and the crowd. She was counting heads. She was taking inventory. That was not the posture of a daughter burying her mother. That was the cold, assessing stance of a liquidator waiting to begin the audit. This rot didn't begin at the cemetery. It had been accumulating for 40 years. Growing up, Deborah was my father's golden child in the specific way that some children become golden, not through effort or character, but through performance. She had the curls, the smile, the uncanny ability to arrange a room's attention around herself without appearing to try. When our father died, she moved immediately to monopolize our mother's world. I couldn't play that game. I had never been built for it. I chose the barracks instead. I looked for value in things you could measure, mileage on a rucksack march, the clean function of a well-maintained rifle, the absolute loyalty of people who would put themselves between you and the thing coming for you. For a long time, I carried the quiet burn of believing our mother couldn't see me past Deborah's shine. I severely underestimated her. When the pancreatic cancer finally tore through her body over the last 2 years, the golden child managed exactly 3 visits in 24 months. 3. And every single time she walked through that front door, it was because her bank account had hit the floor and she needed a handout. My mother never screamed at her, never slammed a door. She just sat in her medical bed, looked at her eldest daughter, and recorded everything quietly in the part of a mind that decides what things are worth. She watched my deployment wire transfers cover the medical bills. She watched Sophie clean bedpans and crush pain medication into applesauce at 3 a.m. so the swallowing would be easier. She watched, she recorded, she decided, and then she acted. The will reading took place the following Thursday. Harold Kimball's office smelled of water-damaged drywall, musty carpet, and coffee that had been sitting on the burner since the previous morning. The 4 of us arranged ourselves around a heavy, badly scratched oak table. Kimball adjusted his thick glasses, cleared his throat, and turned to the 3rd page. The residential property, located on Maple Drive, along with the entirety of the savings accounts totaling $240,000, left in full to my granddaughter Sophie Hunt. He paused, removed his glasses. Read the final handwritten addendum my mother had forced into the document. To Sophie, because she stayed when it actually mattered. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the metallic clank of the old ceiling fan turning overhead. I turned to look at my daughter. Sophie's jaw had dropped. Her face had drained completely. Her hands were shaking against her denim jeans. She wasn't calculating what this meant financially. She was 21 years old, and she had just lost her grandmother, and her grandmother had looked back across whatever remained of her life and chosen her. Sophie didn't want the money. She wanted her grandmother back. Then I turned to look at Deborah. If she had exploded, thrown something, screamed, made her intentions immediately visible, I would have known exactly how to respond. That was predictable. But the golden child didn't move. She sat perfectly still in her high-backed chair, her hands the only thing betraying her. Her blood-red manicured fingernails dug into the cheap leather armrest until her knuckles turned completely white. Her jaw was clamped so tight the muscles in her cheeks twitched. Kimball looked at her over his legal pad. "Ms. Hunt, do you have any questions?" Deborah snapped upright as though a spring had released. She snatched her purse off the table with a violence that made the surface shake. "No." The word came out like a pebble dropping down a dry well. She turned on her heel and marched for the exit. The click of her heels on the hard floor grew fainter and meaner with every step until the heavy doors shut behind her. I reached over and gently pulled Sophie's chair back so she could stand on her trembling legs. My stomach had formed a cold, hard knot. In the Army, when an opposing force suddenly withdraws into the tree line without returning fire, it does not mean they are surrendering the field. It means they are repositioning to dial in the artillery. It means they just acquired your coordinates. Why did my mother leave everything to a 21-year-old kid? The answer is in Sophie's hands. They are not soft. They are calloused from 2 years of work that never stopped and never asked for recognition. 2 years before our mother passed, Sophie had packed her life into cardboard boxes and moved herself onto Maple Drive. She enrolled in nursing school during the day, running on 3 hours of sleep. At night, she worked the graveyard shift at a gas station down the highway to cover groceries. The moment her shift ended, her actual job began. When the cancer reached my mother's bones, the bedroom became a makeshift hospice ward. The air turned chemical, the sting of disinfectant layered over the low sounds of pain between morphine doses. Sophie handled all of it. She lifted my mother's frail body from the sheets at 3 a.m. She wiped away the vomit. She used a plastic spoon to crush the pain medications into applesauce so the swallowing wouldn't cause choking. I was thousands of miles away, stuck inside a concrete bunker in a desert combat zone, tied to operational orders I could not break. The guilt was a physical weight every time I heard my mother coughing through a grainy satellite connection. All I could do was check in during our brief video links. Every single time, the screen showed the same image: Sophie, slumped in a green metal folding chair beside the medical bed, her head against the guardrail, asleep in her winter jacket with the dark purple bruises of total exhaustion under her eyes. She gave up her youth to that sick room. She never complained once. I couldn't be there, so I financed the defense. Every dollar of my officer salary, every cent of hazard pay, money earned by crawling through mud under incoming fire, went straight into my mother's accounts. I paid the hospital deductibles. I paid for the oxygen concentrators keeping her lungs working. I thought I was fortifying the home base. I made a tactical error. I forgot that the rules of honor only apply to soldiers. They don't apply to parasites wearing family colors. Deborah made exactly 3 appearances in 24 months. The first time, she drove up the driveway in her SUV because she needed a $3,000 cash loan to fix her car. She didn't remove her sunglasses inside the house. The second time was Thanksgiving. She arrived late, loaded her plate, and spent the entire dinner loudly complaining that the house smelled like medicine. The second she finished eating, she grabbed her coat and left her dirty plate on the counter for Sophie to wash. She never once stepped foot inside my mother's bedroom. Instead, she stayed in the living room, her eyes moving along the walls the way a crooked assessor's eyes move, running her fingers along the antique silver tea set on the mantel, estimating, calculating, treating our dying mother like inventory waiting to be cleared. Sophie just stood there, pouring coffee for her aunt, biting her lip, keeping peace the way good people keep peace when they don't yet understand that they're not in a situation where peace is on offer. The third visit was the breaking point. My mother was on high-flow oxygen, her chest laboring with every breath. I was home on emergency leave. I was standing at the kitchen sink when I saw Deborah slip through the back door into the yard. Her movements were careful. She pulled out her phone and started whispering, but the window above the sink was open, and every single word came through clean. "Ray," she said, her voice sharpened with greed, "you need to ask the real estate people what the houses on Maple Drive are going for right now. The old lady is weak. She's too far gone to change anything anyway. We need to figure out the listing price. We're selling this place the second she drops." Right then, the oxygen machine in the next room released a loud, rhythmic bleep. It sounded like a countdown timer. My hand had clenched so hard around the aluminum soda can I was holding that the metal snapped and sliced my palm. Dark blood dripped into the white sink. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to go through that screen door and end the conversation immediately. I didn't. I forced my breathing down. I locked everything into a cold box. I walked away from the window and went back to my mother's room. Sophie was on the edge of the mattress, feeding her grandmother water from a tiny spoon, one careful drop at a time. Deborah had no idea what she had just done. She thought she was the smartest person within 20 miles. From that exact moment in the backyard, she hadn't just lost the house. She had dug her own grave. And I was going to make sure the execution was absolute. 48 hours after the will was made public, the first shot came. Saturday night, my phone lit up with Deborah's name. Her voice came through the speaker, flat and practiced, her husband Ray audibly prompting lines in the background. "That will is garbage, Alicia. Mom was out of her mind on medication. Sophie lived under her roof and manipulated a dying woman. That property needs to be split, 50-50. I kept my eyes locked on the overgrown grass outside the kitchen window. The doctor signed off on her chart, Deborah. Mom was fully lucid. The lawyer signed it. She left exactly what she intended. Deborah's composure shattered through the speaker, her voice rising into a screech. "Are you really going to let a 21-year-old kid swallow an entire estate? I will tie you up in court for years. I will sue." I pressed the red button. Cut her off. In the Army, when an enemy combatant starts shouting threats from across the ridge, you don't shout back. You pull the charging handle and chamber a fresh round. Monday morning, I drove downtown to the brick building housing Morrison and Finch. I pushed into the office of Robert Webb without waiting to be invited. The man was almost 6.5 feet of bone and muscle in a sharp charcoal suit, with eyes like 2 chips of flint. He handled the nastiest inheritance disputes in the state with the specific coldness of someone who understood that family conflict was simply war conducted in a courthouse. I dropped my black leather briefcase on his polished desk. "My sister is about to launch a psychological campaign to force my daughter to surrender the estate," I said, keeping my voice at the low, steady register I used for serious briefings. "I need an iron shield around that kid." I leaned forward, knuckles on the edge of his desk. "And I want a full forensic audit of every single one of my mother's accounts for the last 12 months. Follow every dollar." Webb leaned back in his chair. A slow, dangerous smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. He recognized what he was looking at. 2 weeks later, the brown envelope arrived. I sat at my kitchen table, took out my utility knife, and sliced it open with a clean hiss. 6 pages of account statements. I ran my eyes down the columns of numbers. Then my gaze stopped. 6 separate cash withdrawals. April, $3,000. August, $5,000. Total, $15,000 flat. The dates were a physical impossibility. In April and August, my mother was not at a bank drive-through. She was in the intensive care unit, hooked to machines, running a constant morphine drip. She didn't have the strength to lift a plastic cup to her own lips, let alone walk out of a bank with thousands of dollars. Every cent of hazard pay I had earned by crawling through the dirt under a burning sun, every dollar I believed was keeping her safe, had been systematically drained. But the ugliness went deeper. The next morning, Webb reached into his drawer and slid 3 original withdrawal slips across his desk. He told me to look closely at the signature line. I bent over the paper. The signature read Ruth Hunt. But it was not her hand. My mother's handwriting, the regular, thin, delicate cursive she had used her entire life, was completely gone. In its place were heavy, rigid, forced vertical strokes. The signature of a strong, healthy hand pressing a pen through paper with intent. Deborah had stood beside my mother's hospital bed, looked at her failing body, and forged her name. For quick cash. I straightened up. My jaw was locked so tight the bone in my temple ached. Can we call the county prosecutor right now? I want her in a squad car. Webb slowly pulled the slips back into his folder. He shook his head. If we move now, we pull the trip wire too early and spook the snake. Don't touch her yet. Let her think she won. Let her walk confidently straight into the minefield with no path left to retreat. I sat back. My chest rose and fell in a slow, controlled rhythm. The weapon was loaded. The safety was off. Now I had to wait in the dark for the target to step onto the pressure plate. When a snake finds the front door blocked, it doesn't starve. It changes its angle of attack. Since Deborah couldn't use the legal system to rob a 21-year-old kid, she decided to weaponize the only thing she had left. Her mouth. She launched a systematic campaign of psychological warfare. She picked up her landline and called every extended relative scattered across Ohio. She had a script. She performed it beautifully. According to her, our mother had been completely senile, a helpless old woman destroyed by medication, easily manipulated by a conniving young girl who had maneuvered herself into a caregiving position to control the paperwork. And me, I was the puppet master, the greedy younger sister pulling strings from the shadows to secure a payday that made up for my modest military salary. The rumors moved through our family like toxic fluid leaking into the groundwater. My phone became a war zone. Aunt Ellen called twice before dinner, her voice dripping with passive-aggressive hostility. Then came Brenda, Deborah's bitter mother-in-law, who went directly to social media with public posts about family greed, ungrateful children, and karma visiting those who rob the elderly. These were the exact same people who hadn't contributed a single dollar toward my mother's medical bills. The aunts and uncles who couldn't be bothered to drive 20 miles when she was withered down to 80 pounds in a hospice bed. People who had never lost a single night of sleep listening to an old woman choke on her own lungs. Now they were the self-appointed judges of family morality, hiding behind computer screens, throwing mud at a kid who had given up her entire youth to keep her grandmother alive. By Tuesday night, the psychological warfare escalated into physical intimidation. Just after 9 p.m., blinding cones of halogen headlights pierced straight through our front windows. A rusted old pickup truck had jumped the curb and stopped in my driveway. The muffler was completely gone. The engine roared like something broken. Thick exhaust smoke billowed across the front yard. Ray Kessler, Deborah's husband, a man who had abandoned his family 2 years prior to run off with a girlfriend, only to crawl back the second he smelled $240,000, was playing the role of the tough family patriarch. I pushed the front door open and walked onto the porch. I stood at the top of the steps with my arms crossed. The April wind cut through my thin t-shirt. I didn't move an inch. Ray rolled his window down, leaned out, took a long drag from a cigarette, and spat onto my gravel driveway. "This is an internal family matter, Alicia. Get your fancy lawyers out of our business. Tell your kid to sign the house over, split the cash, and we can make all of this go away." I looked down at him through the glare of his high beams and evaluated him the exact same way I evaluated low-level threats on a standard field map. Weak jaw, no spine, all noise. This stopped being an internal family matter, I said, dropping into the quiet register that makes people lean in even when every instinct tells them to lean back. The exact second your wife called my daughter a thief in a hospital parking lot. Ray's face twisted. "You think just because you wear that uniform." I walked down the 3 concrete steps, crossed the gravel, and slammed my open palm hard onto the hot, vibrating metal of his truck door. I leaned in close enough to see exactly what was behind his eyes. "You have 60 seconds to back this piece of junk off my property." I spaced the words out like stakes being driven into ground. "If it's still on my grass when that clock hits 1 minute, I'm calling the county sheriff." He wanted an easy mark. He wanted a frightened single mother who would cry and negotiate. He sat there for 20 minutes, revving his engine, filling my yard with exhaust smoke. I stood next to his door the entire time with my eyes locked on his side mirror. Finally, he slammed the transmission into reverse, spun his tires against the gravel, and disappeared into the dark. Ray was a scout. A low-rent probe sent to test the perimeter. Deborah knew she couldn't break me. But when an enemy realizes your defensive line is solid, they don't go home. They bypass your strong points. They hunt for the soft target. They go after your rear guard. The clock on the microwave showed 10:04 p.m. when my phone rang. "Sophie." I answered immediately. No greeting on the other end. Just the raw, frantic sound of shallow, panicked breathing, followed by a heavy choked sob she was desperately trying to swallow. "Mom," her voice cracked, tiny, vibrating like a dry leaf in a winter wind. Aunt Deborah just cornered me. Every muscle in my chest locked down into a violent frozen cramp. The air left my lungs. Sophie's car door had barely stopped moving when she stumbled out of it, her face pale under the porch light. Her nursing scrubs were wrinkled from a 12-hour clinical rotation. Her student badge swung wildly. She leaned against the wall and let out a long, ragged gasp. Through hiccups, the story came out. Sophie had finished her shift and was walking to her car with classmates under the parking lot lights when Deborah struck. She had been waiting in her black SUV. A predator at rest. The moment she spotted Sophie, she got out and crossed the concrete while screaming before she even reached the sidewalk. "You little thief! You stole what belongs to me. You brainwashed a dying old woman in her hospital bed. Your grandmother would be absolutely disgusted by the piece of garbage you are." Sophie had frozen between the parked cars, her keys shaking. Her classmates backed away in shock. The kid who had spent 2 straight years scrubbing hospice sheets, lifting her dying grandmother to change soiled clothes, and crushing pain pills, branded a common criminal in front of the people she worked with every single day. Sophie collapsed into the kitchen chair. She pushed the plate of cold noodles I had made away with a weak hand. "Mom," her eyes were bloodshot and swollen. "Please, let us just give it all back. The house, the money, all of it. I cannot do this anymore. I have my final board exams next month. I cannot focus on school or shifts if I have to spend every hour looking over my shoulder. I am so tired. I am just so broken. A heavy tear rolled down her pale cheek and fell into the cold noodles. Every sob felt like shrapnel piercing my rib cage. I stood at the counter with my fingers locked around the granite. A brutal truth cut through me in that quiet kitchen. Comrades who shared none of my blood had gladly thrown their bodies over mine to shield me from mortar fire. Yet here, the woman who had shared my mother's DNA was systematically destroying my daughter's mind for a cash payout. I took one long breath, forced the rage down into the cold box where I keep the things that are too dangerous to act on immediately. I took my glass of water and set it on the table in front of Sophie with a sharp, deliberate clack. I pulled out the chair directly opposite her and sat down. I did not offer a soft, useless hug. I did not offer empty comfort. I locked my eyes onto her trembling face with the same absolute authority I used to steady terrified young soldiers under rocket fire. "Look at me, Sophie." As she looked, "You are not signing any paper. You are not giving her a single dime. Your grandmother left that property to you because she saw Deborah's greed and her neglect and her theft. With her very last breath, she chose you." I leaned across the table, my shadow falling over her plate. Cowardice does not buy peace. It only buys a longer lease on extortion. Feed a parasite today, it shows up hungrier tomorrow. Sophie looked at me for 5 full seconds. Saw no hesitation. I nodded. She used her sleeve to wipe her eyes. The trembling in her shoulders slowed and stopped. I stood up, walked down the narrow hallway to my private office, and pulled the door shut behind me. The room was dark, lit only by the pale gray moonlight cutting through the window blinds. I opened my briefcase, touched the slick cold paper of the forensic audit. The 3 forged signatures. Deborah believed terrorizing a 21-year-old kid would force a quick surrender before I could organize a response. She made a catastrophic strategic error. Attacking my daughter did not bring her closer to the house on Maple Drive. It removed her last remaining chance for mercy. I picked up my phone and called Robert Webb. Send the formal ultimatum tomorrow morning. Force her directly into a corner. A low, dangerous rumble came through the line. Consider it done, Major. The trap is set. 2 days before the final hammer dropped, the entire foundation shifted. Sophie was back at the house, clearing out the remaining boxes from our mother's bedroom. Dead quiet in the house, afternoon light coming through the dust motes, the sound of packing tape being ripped from the roll. She was working inside the deep walk-in closet, pulling down old winter coats that smelled of stale wool, when her fingers hit something heavy on the top shelf. A jewelry box. Solid cedar, covered in decades of gray dust. Inside, a tangle of cheap silver-plated costume jewelry gone completely black with age. But under the metal chains, resting flat against the faded red velvet lining at the very bottom of the box, was a single sheet of standard yellow legal pad paper, folded into 4 tight squares. Sophie called me. No greeting. Just a hitched breath over the speaker. "Mom, you need to come right now." I dropped my pen, grabbed my keys, and drove like a lunatic down Route 4, roaring through a stale yellow light at the intersection, tearing up the gravel driveway of Maple Drive inside 10 minutes flat. I pushed the door open and found Sophie in the hallway. I took the yellow paper. stood back against the wall. The sharp sting of cedar and mothballs came off the paper as I unfolded it. My mother's handwriting. Fatting blue ballpoint ink. The letters were shaky, uneven, clearly written by fingers weakened by radiation and IV lines. But the downward strokes were pressed deep into the paper with the desperate, deliberate intent of someone who needed to be understood. This was a tactical intelligence report delivered from the grave. I cleared my throat and read it aloud into the empty hallway. Dear Sophie, if you are reading this, it means Lawyer Kimball has already opened the big envelope, and your Aunt Deborah is currently screaming down the house. I know she is. I know my eldest daughter better than she thinks. I paused. Hit the next paragraph. Deborah thinks she is entitled to this estate. She forgets the ledger. Over the last 15 years, your aunt came to this house and borrowed a total of $80,000 in cash, checks for fake business ventures, money to clear gambling debts, cash for luxury vacations she couldn't afford but wanted anyway. She never paid back a single dime. She treated my life savings like an open vault. I stopped reading for a moment. The air in the hallway turned cold. $80,000. $80,000 systematically pulled from an old woman's savings while I was overseas earning pennies in the mud. My jaw clenched so hard the bone in my temple ached. I kept reading. But the money isn't why I'm writing this. Last March, when they put me in the intensive care unit under the morphine drip, I woke up in the dark. The room was dark. The machines were humming. I saw Deborah by my bedside. She wasn't holding my hand. She was rummaging through my purse, taking my bank book and a pen. She was taking from me while I was too weak to lift my head. I didn't call the nurses. I didn't have the strength to argue with a thief wearing my daughter's face. So I closed my eyes, feigned sleep, and let her think she had won. Beside me, Sophie covered her mouth with both hands. A tiny choked sob escaped her throat. The image hit us both like a physical blow. Our mother, withered to skin and bones, trapped under an oxygen mask, watching her own flesh and blood forge her name on withdrawal slips in the dark of a hospital room. Carrying that disgusting betrayal in total silence. Letting it gnaw at her alongside the cancer cells. I moved to the final lines. My mother's handwriting straightened, as though she had gathered every remaining ounce of strength for the finish. So I rebuilt the perimeter, Sophie. I changed the paperwork with Kimball. I did it because love should never be a debt for crooked people to collect. Show this yellow paper to your mother. Alicia will know exactly what to do with it. Hold the line, sweetheart. The silence that followed in that empty house was absolute. Sophie's quiet tears ran down her fingers, but the panic was completely gone from her face. In its place was something colder and more certain. The truth had just stripped away every single piece of leverage Deborah had been carrying. My mother had not been senile. She had not been confused. The will was not the result of manipulation. It was a calculated, cold-blooded execution of justice. A dying woman had disarmed her own golden child from a hospital bed and handed the heavy artillery directly to us. I carefully refolded the yellow paper back into its original 4 squares. I unbuttoned the left chest pocket of my uniform shirt, slipped the letter inside right behind my military identification card, and snapped the metal button shut. The weapon was loaded. The moment was coming. Around 3 that afternoon, Deborah's text arrived on Sophie's phone. "Sophie, sweetheart, we need to talk like adults. Just family. No outside interference. Saturday afternoon, 2 p.m. at the old house on Maple Drive. Let us settle this paperwork nicely so we can all move on." An unmasked ambush dressed as an olive branch. Deborah thought she could isolate a 21-year-old away from her mother, back her into a corner, and bully her into signing a property waiver before the courts got further involved. "Do you want to go?" I asked Sophie, my voice empty of emotion. Sophie looked at the brass button on my chest pocket, the one holding her grandmother's letter. Her jaw tightened. "Yes," she said. "Good." I reached down and took the briefcase from the chair. Let them build their trap. Let them think we're walking in blind. Our only job is to step onto their grid, wait for them to close the gate, and then tear the entire forest down. Exactly 2 p.m., Saturday. The yellow wooden house on Maple Drive stood quiet under a heavy overcast Ohio sky. The air smelled of oncoming rain and dead leaves rotting in the gutters. I pulled my truck over a full block away and killed the engine. I checked the brass button on my chest pocket, and I watched Sophie walk up the concrete driveway alone. She was the bait. I was the rear guard. The moment her sneakers crossed the threshold and the heavy oak door pulled shut behind her, the illusion of a family gathering dissolved. No beef stew on the stove. No coffee on the counter. No warmth of any kind. A textbook ambush staged in a faded living room. Deborah sat dead center on the worn red velvet sofa, her legs crossed tightly, her fingers tracing the gold clasp of her handbag. Ray Kessler stood anchored beside the bay window, arms crossed over his flannel shirt, heavy boots planted wide on the old carpet like a bouncer at a criminal establishment. In the corner sat Brenda, Deborah's bitter mother-in-law, her thin lips pressed into a bloodless line, arms locked across her chest as she glared at my daughter. And at the dining table sat Neil Pratt, bottom feeder attorney. The man made his living fixing low-level DUI charges and writing crooked insurance releases. He was Ray's Friday night drinking buddy. He smelled faintly of stale peppermint and cheap gin. Pratt unlatched his imitation leather briefcase. The dual metal locks gave a sharp, dry double click that echoed off the bare drywall. He pulled out a thick brown manila envelope and slid a cheap plastic ballpoint pen across the scratched oak table toward Sophie. "Sign the bottom line on page 4. He tapped his nicotine-stained fingernail against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. You sign the line, the title transfers, and we wrap this entire headache up in less than 5 minutes. Clean, simple, completely legal." Sophie didn't touch the pen. She looked at the document. The bold black letters at the top stared back at her. Voluntary waiver of inheritance rights and full release of estate claims. Not a compromise. A total unconditional surrender document designed to strip a 21-year-old kid of every square inch of property, every cent of savings, and her legal right to ever file an appeal. A highway robbery wrapped in a civil cover sheet. Deborah leaned forward, her heavy artificial lavender perfume rolling off her skin in suffocating waves. "Sophie, honey, you have to understand," she murmured, her eyes wide with manufactured concern. "Your grandmother simply wasn't right at the end. The medication confused her. You're only 21, you're a child. Handling that amount of money will only ruin your focus at school. Let your aunt take the burden. I will preserve this house for the family. From the corner, Brenda chimed in. A good grandchild doesn't go around robbing her own flesh and blood, Sophie. It's shameful. They stared my daughter down, 3 adults and a lawyer. Their eyes locked onto her face like vultures circling a wounded animal in a ditch. They wanted to use the word family like a set of handcuffs, binding her hands while they emptied her pockets. But Sophie remembered the kitchen table. She remembered the absolute certainty in my voice. She sat perfectly straight, shoulders squared, chin up, hands flat against her denim thighs. She did not let her fingers drift anywhere near that pen. I am not signing this. Her voice was small on the first word, then hardened immediately as she looked Pratt directly in the eye. I am not signing anything until I have reviewed this document with my own legal counsel. The greasy smile on Pratt's face froze. Deborah's performance evaporated in an instant. She slammed her open palm down onto the sofa cushion, sending a cloud of dust into the afternoon light. Do not be an ungrateful little brat. Her voice cracked with pure venom. You sign that paper right now, or I will drag your name through every probate court in this state. I will sue you for elder fraud. I will destroy your nursing career before it even starts. Ray Kessler stepped away from the bay window. He was a large man, over 200 pounds, and he intended to use every ounce of his physical size as a weapon. His heavy boots made the floorboards groan as he crossed the room toward Sophie. His thick calloused hand rose toward her shoulder. Exactly then. The deadbolt snapped. The heavy oak door flew inward and slammed against the interior wall with an explosive crack that shook every window in the house. The rusty metal hinges shrieked. I stepped over the threshold. I dropped my briefcase by the foot of the wooden chair. The weight hit the floorboards with a solid thud. I didn't knock. I didn't ask for permission. I took 3 long strides across the room and planted myself directly beside Sophie, my boots gripping the faded carpet. My posture was the product of 20 years in the field, straight, still, the specific physicality of someone who has been in rooms far more dangerous than this one and is not particularly impressed. Deborah jumped off the sofa as if electrocuted. Her face turned the color of spoiled milk. Alicia, she shrieked, her voice cracking, you weren't invited. This is a private family meeting. Neil Pratt cleared his throat, adjusting his collar, attempting to gather whatever authority he believed he still had. Ma'am, I'm providing private legal counsel to this family. Please step outside immediately. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned my head down and locked my eyes onto his face with the same cold crosshairs I used on the firing range. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Private counsel, I said. My voice was a flat, gritty rasp that cut through the hum of the old refrigerator like a blade through soft material. You have an inheritance waiver on the wood. You have a 21-year-old kid cornered in a chair. But I don't see an independent attorney representing the person who is supposed to sign that document. I leaned my weight forward across the table, bringing my face within 6 inches of his. Pratt flinched backward into his seat. His throat moved as he swallowed. His small, watery eyes darted toward the door. This isn't counsel, Pratt. Each word came out cold and dry as a bullet casing hitting the ground. This is a shakedown. I know exactly who you are. Neil Pratt, bottom feeder operation on the north side of town. Low-level speeding tickets, fender benders, cheap, uncontested divorces. Any piece of paper my daughter signs in this house under your threats, without her own attorney present, is completely dead on arrival before a county judge. Pratt's hands started to shake. He reached thin fingers toward the waiver, trying to slide it toward his briefcase. I slammed my open palm down onto the paper with an explosive crack that made the plastic pen jump off the table. "Don't touch it." I pinned the document flat. "That stays exactly where it is. That is evidence of criminal coercion." Right then, the kitchen door swung open. Aunt Ellen stepped in, a bottle of cheap white wine under her arm, brought to celebrate what she had assumed would be a quick signing. She took one look at the frozen room. Her eyes moved from my locked uniform pocket down to the legal paper under my hand. Her jaw went slack. The realization hit her like ice water. She was not here for a family conversation. She had been brought in as a blind ornament for a robbery. She froze on the threshold. The time was right. The perimeter was secure. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and sent a single text to the top of my contacts list. "Get in." 30 seconds of absolute suffocating silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then 3 heavy raps exploded against the door frame. Boom, boom, boom. Robert Webb stepped directly into the low-ceiling room. 6 feet and 5 inches of solid bone in a sharp iron-gray charcoal suit that made the entire living room look small and filthy. He carried his heavy leather case, and the sheer weight of his presence made Deborah stagger backward until her hip slammed hard against the kitchen counter. "This is ridiculous," Deborah ranted, her voice climbing into an unhinged screech as she stared at the giant filling her doorway. "Get these people out of my mother's house." Webb didn't turn his chin toward her. He didn't acknowledge her existence. He walked straight to the table, his heavy leather shoes making the floorboards flex under his weight. He reached down, snatched the yellow waiver document from the table, held it to his face for exactly 3 seconds, and then threw it back down like a piece of used grease rag. "Non-compensated asset forfeiture waiver," he said, his deep baritone voice vibrating the glass window panes behind Ray. "No notary seal. No independent review. Tell me, Pratt, do you hold a current certification from the state bar for probate and estate administration?" A pause. "No, I didn't think so. You're playing with live high-voltage wire, son." Webb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp white legal document stamped with a heavy blue emblem. He dropped it onto the center of the table like a final verdict. The probate court order was finalized as of 9 a.m. yesterday morning. His voice was flat and absolute as stone. "The final will left by Ruth Hunt is fully authenticated. Sophie Hunt is the sole legal owner of this residential property and all associated accounts. That is an ironclad order from a state judge." Ray Kessler's chest deflated instantly. The tough guy act vanished. He looked at Webb's shoulders, looked at the court order, didn't waste a single breath. He grabbed his work jacket from the sofa, turned on his heel, and slipped through the laundry door into the alley, his boots scuffling as he fled. Neil Pratt was right behind him. His face completely white, sweat beading along his hairline. He shoved his pen into his pocket, grabbed his briefcase, and scrambled out the front door into the gray rain without looking back. The defensive line was broken. The rats had abandoned the ship. I walked slowly across the room, pulled the heavy front door shut, and threw the deadbolt into place. The metallic snap was final. I turned around and looked at my sister, alone now against the kitchen counter. I unzipped my briefcase, reached inside for the black folder. 6 separate cash withdrawals, I said, my voice moving with the flat, cold rhythm of a casualty report. I tossed the first manila envelope onto the scratched glass coffee table. It hit the surface with a dull thud. April, $3,000. August, $5,000. Total, $15,000 flat. Every single dime pulled from the drive-through lane during the exact weeks Mom was lying on her back in the intensive care unit. Deborah's eyes went wide. The skin around her cheekbones tightened. She grabbed the back of the sofa to steady her legs. Her breathing turned shallow. Brenda's jaw dropped open, her bitter mouth freezing shut as she looked at the paper on the table, unable to squeeze out a single word. She couldn't lift a plastic cup of water to her own lips during those weeks. Deborah, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. So you tell me, how does a dying woman walk into a bank branch to pull out cash? I didn't give her a second to breathe. I pulled out the second envelope and dropped it on top of the first. High-resolution forensic photos of 3 bank withdrawal slips. Look at the bottom line, Ellen. I tapped my knuckle against the glass, making the paper rattle. 3 separate slips with Mom's name written at the signature line. But the forensic examiner hired by Mr. Webb spent 48 hours analyzing the pen pressure. It wasn't her hand. The thin, delicate strokes she used her entire life were replaced by heavy, forced, rigid lines. The strokes of a strong, healthy adult driving a pen through paper with deliberate intent. Webb stepped forward, his 6'5" frame casting a long shadow over the table. Skimming the accounts of a dependent elderly person is elder financial abuse, he said, looking directly into Deborah's pale face. Forging financial documents to execute those transactions is a felony. Whether this file lands on the desk of the county prosecutor by 5 p.m. Monday depends entirely on your compliance from this exact second forward. Deborah gasped. Her knees buckled slightly. Her expensive purse slipped from her shoulder and hit the floorboard, spilling a lipstick and car keys into the dust. She slammed both palms down onto the glass table. You have no right, she shrieked, her voice cracking into something raw and cornered. She was my mother, too. She loved me more than anyone. She wanted me to have that money. I let out a short, dry sound from the back of my throat. Not humor. Just the specific exhale of someone who has been waiting a long time for the truth to arrive in a room. Yes, she loved you, I said, and she spent her last hours making sure you received exactly what you earned. I reached into my uniform shirt pocket, unbuttoned the brass snap, pulled out the yellow legal paper, unfolded it slowly. Let the sharp sting of cedar wood and old mothballs fill the space between us. I held it up, and I read every word. Every sentence my mother had pressed into that yellow paper with the dying strength of hands that had made their decision. The $80,000 borrowed and never returned. The night in the hospital room, darkness, machines humming, watching her own daughter forge her name by the glow of a pen light, too weak to lift her head, feigning sleep so the thief would leave. The decision to rebuild the perimeter, to change the paperwork, to make certain that love would not become a debt for crooked people to collect. The words hung in the stagnant air like toxic smoke. The illusion of the golden child, constructed over 40 years of performance and manipulation, was ripped from its frame and laid bare. In front of her own family. Her mother-in-law, Brenda, turned her face away in disgust. Aunt Ellen stood frozen by the kitchen door, her fingers trembling against the wine bottle she hadn't put down. Deborah's arrogance didn't just crack. It shattered. She sank downward slowly, her joints giving out, sliding down the drywall until she collapsed onto the old carpet. The mascara around her eyes mixed with her tears and carved dirty gray tracks down her expensive foundation. She began to sob. "Ray is gone," she blubbered, her forehead nearly touching her boots. He took the car. The bank sent a foreclosure notice on our house last Tuesday. I am 45 years old and I have nothing left. I needed that cash. Please, you are my sister. You cannot do this to me. I stood above her, perfectly straight, my chest rising and falling in a slow, disciplined rhythm. There was no joy in my lungs. There was no victory celebration. Looking at my own sister folded on the old carpet, I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a deep, heavy emptiness. The cold recognition that our family had been nothing but a house of cards built on top of a minefield. But when I looked at the dark purple bruises of exhaustion still sitting under Sophie's eyes, the cold stone inside my chest hardened back into iron. Being desperate doesn't give you the right to be cruel to a 21-year-old kid, I said quietly. You chose this path, Deborah, every single mile of it. I gathered the evidence from the table and slid it back into my briefcase. Pulled the zipper closed. The teeth bit together with a sharp, final click. I turned my back on the weeping woman on the floor. I looked at my daughter. Mission complete, Sophie. Grab your jacket, we're leaving. 3 weeks after the floor collapsed beneath Deborah's feet in that faded living room, the county probate court finalized the transfer. The yellow house on Maple Drive and the $240,000 in savings officially belonged to Sophie. State seal, clean, binding. I was not finished. In my line of work, you do not give an adversary room to regroup. Robert Webb drafted the final written demand on his firm's heavy bond paper. 3 sentences. Return the $15,000 stolen from Ruth Hunt's account within 30 days, or the forensic audit, the bank security footage, and the expert signature verification analysis would be hand-delivered to the county prosecutor's desk before the close of business. No phone calls. No negotiations. 10 days later, a certified envelope arrived at Webb's office. Inside, a cashier's check for $15,000 flat. No note. No explanation. No apology. Deborah had squeezed the money from whatever credit lines she had remaining, coughing it up to stay out of a gray federal jumpsuit. The moment that check cleared, I built a complete perimeter. No contact. Deborah's number blocked, her email blacklisted, Ray's number blocked before he could attempt to crawl back. I did not care that the bank was moving forward with the foreclosure on her suburban house. I did not care that she was 45 years old and sitting in an empty apartment with nothing left to her name. I cut the desperate need to be recognized or loved by an older sister who had revealed herself to be nothing but a parasite. Aunt Ellen drove her old sedan to the house on a quiet Tuesday evening. She did not walk in with excuses. She stood on the concrete porch, holding a warm tray of homemade peach cobbler, her eyes red-rimmed and downcast. As she looked at Sophie, her hands trembled slightly against the aluminum pan. She apologized, admitted she had let Deborah's venomous messaging blind her, admitted she was wrong. We took the cobbler. We let her sit at the kitchen table. I allowed her back into our space, but the terms of engagement had shifted permanently. The rules of this family were no longer dictated by guilt or loud manipulation. I drew the lines now. By the start of the following month, Sophie moved her clothes and books into the house on Maple Drive. She used a portion of the inheritance to hire a local contractor to pull out the rotting floorboards near the laundry room and seal the drafts under the bay window. The heavy, suffocating smell of stale grease and hospital-grade disinfectant was completely gone. In its place, the clean, honest scent of fresh pine timber and new paint. She chose pale blue for her grandmother's bedroom. When I walked up the stairs to check on her progress one Friday afternoon, the sun was cutting clean through the white curtains, casting long squares of warm light across the hardwood floor. Sophie was standing on an old wooden step stool in front of the built-in bookshelf. She was holding the solid cedar jewelry box. She reached up and placed it on the very highest shelf, right next to her nursing textbooks. Inside that cedar frame rested the yellow legal pad letter. The final piece of tactical intelligence our mother had written with her dying hands. The document that had saved everything. Sophie turned around. And she smiled. For the first time in 2 long, grueling years, her eyes were completely clear. The purple shadows of exhaustion were gone. The fear that had kept her shoulders hunched for months had dissolved. She was 21 years old. She had taken the worst beating her own bloodline could deliver. She was still standing perfectly straight. I am standing at the kitchen sink right now, letting hot water run over my hands as I scrape the dinner plates. Through the open doorway leading into the living room, the low, warm sound of Sophie and Aunt Ellen laughing over an old photo album drifts across the linoleum. The sound is steady. It is safe. Through this entire campaign, I learned a brutal and unyielding truth. You do not need to scream to break your enemy. You do not need to engage in shouting matches on a gravel driveway or throw mud back into the swamp. The ultimate weapon is not anger. The ultimate weapon is preparation. It is the absolute discipline of waiting in the dark, with the facts on your side and the cold willingness to act when your family is threatened. Nobody gets to strip away the honest work of a good kid just because they share the same last name. Patience is not weakness. Tactical preparation is not revenge. And standing up to hold the line for your own rear guard is something an American soldier will never have to apologize for. I turn the faucet off. Fold the kitchen towel into a perfect square. Set it on the counter. The kitchen is quiet. The perimeter is secure. They came for the house. They came for the money. They came for the girl who had given everything she had to keep an old woman alive. And they got exactly what my mother had always intended to give them. And nothing. Because the people who wanted to collect a debt from love made one mistake that all the lawyers and shakedowns and forged signatures in the world couldn't fix. They underestimated the woman who raised me. And they completely underestimated what she left behind. They called it a family meeting. It was an ambush. And they forgot that the woman they were trying to rob had a mother who saw everything, and a mother who spent her last breath making sure justice was already loaded and waiting. Have you ever watched someone fight from their deathbed to protect the person who showed up? Tell me below. And if you know someone who carried the weight while everyone else showed up only for the payout, send this to them. They'll know exactly what it means.